So I'm going to talk about how we estimate the returning stock of Atlantic salmon with multibeam sonar on the River Teifi in Wales. So we have 3 permanent multibeam sites in Wales at the moment. The River Teifi is the blue river on the west coast of Wales there on the left of that map. The monitoring site is the red square at the bottom end of the catchment, and that's about 3 kilometres above the tidal limit, so down on the lower river. So the Glan Teifi monitoring site on the River Teifi has been operational since 2010, and it's been producing data that we've used for stock assessment and spawning compliance and estimated egg deposition since inception, really. It was originally a Didson site, so we used Didson on the site originally, and the Didson is a forerunner to the Aris. Since 2016, we've replaced it with an Aris. The River Teifi at the monitoring site is 25 metres wide, so I guess it's a relatively small river in comparison to some of your Scottish rivers. So this is a photograph of the monitoring site. This photo was taken from the opposite bank to where the equipment is mounted. So you see that if you see the scaffolding structure on the other side, sonar gets attached to that, and the two parallel bars running up the bank are basically runners, and the trolley there, which is labelled at the bottom, that gets pulled up and down the runners, and the Aris or whatever sonar we're using at the time gets fixed to that trolley. But this allows us to access the equipment during high flows without any staff members having to get into the river, and that's quite useful really if you need to do any maintenance during emergency, sort of in an emergency or during flood conditions. And often you get debris sort of caught up on the runners and stuff, and that can be quite useful for clearing it out. That picture there is a picture of a Didson, the forerunner to the Aris that I mentioned, and that's been attached to the trolley, and that's about to get pushed down into the river and fixed into place. So multibeam sonar, well, Marcus has already talked a bit about how they work, so I won't spend too much time on this. But basically, it creates it sort of captures video quality images using multiple sound beams. And the diagram on the bottom there sort of gives an idea of how it works. There's like 96 individual beams, and they get sampled, and from that it creates an image. And it has a defined angle, so it has quite a wide field of view. It's 14 degrees vertically, and that's quite useful really in that you can kind of cover a large area of your water column. This is a clip from the Teifi site. There's a salmon there just swimming up at 17 metres, but you've seen quite a few of these images, so I won't spend too long with this. So we're collecting this kind of data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 9 months of the year in the case of the Teifi site. So obviously quite a lot of footage there. So the question is, and the tricky part of running these sort of Aris sonars is how do you convert all that footage into sort of quantitative data on fish counts that we can use for management purposes? Well, there is a lot of auto tracking software available. Much of this is commercially available, things like EchoView and Sonar 5, for instance. But we found that on the Teifi site anyway, that they haven't really worked very well, and it's not really viable. Why? Well, the reasons is because of some of the things we've already heard about, but mainly due to fish milling around shoaling. And when they sort of pass over each other or mix the sort of tracks up, the auto trackers tend to break down and don't work so well. Also, we get sort of non-targets, so things like otters and eels and things like that, where the auto trackers will struggle to separate them from fish. Now, site selection, I've highlighted this here. Site selection is really important, as Marcus mentioned earlier. If you get the right site, you might be able to reduce some of these issues. But we've to be honest, we found that on most lower river sites, we tend to get these issues at some point or another. Because, for instance, when the flows are high, you might find that a particular site might be great for fish not holding there, but you'll often find that during low flow conditions, the reverse is true. AI, which has been already mentioned, we have started to look into the use of AI But as yet, I haven't seen sort of a practical solution involving AI, but that's not to say it won't come in the future, and it is rapidly developing. So we'll have to sort of see what happens with that. The system we've developed, though, is a semi-automated approach on the Teifi, which sort of works reasonably for us. So it's this two-step approach. Step one uses some software called multibeam tools, which we've developed internally in NRW. Now, this software has a lot of sort of motion detection algorithms that we use to run through the data, all our data files. And what it'll do, it'll go through each frame in all the files, and it'll look for where there's motion. And the motion could be caused by fish, hopefully, but also other things like debris and otters and other kind of targets. But it'll take those frames out of those files then and stitch them together into a sort of a small concentrated file, basically, with just fish activity. And that can sort of reduce the data down to between 5 and 30% of the original size. So it can be quite a big help, really. And then step two will be the time-consuming part, where our staff members will basically review the data by watching it, and a bit like using the software that Marcus showed you earlier, the Irish Fish software that's freely available and supplied by Soundmetrics with the Irish unit. So how long does it take us to process the data in this way? Well, despite sort of the improvements in motion detection, it's still quite time consuming, and it can take from like half an hour to do a day up to about 3 hours during sort of bad conditions. By bad conditions, I mean where we have usually a lot of sea trout milling around, and that can really slow the process down. And using the Irish Fish software, we'll measure each fish, and then the fish events get logged in a text file, and that gets imported into a database for further analysis. We've got sort of automated processes for taking the events out and importing them into our sort of final database, and that can be quite handy because it can reduce a lot of the file manipulation. So how accurate are the counts we've been producing? We've done quite a bit of work looking into and evaluating this, and it's quite important because obviously this data is already being used for spawning compliance estimates. So first thing I like to look at is sources of bias. So are we undercounting or overcounting in places? So the first place maybe to start with here is the detection efficiency of the ARIS. And by detection efficiency, I mean what proportion of fish is the ARIS actually counting that is going through the acoustic beam in the monitored area. So the good news on this is that studies in the US have compared the counts from counting towers, which are considered to be the sort of most accurate counters they have. And these are people basically stood on top of towers, watching a fish or salmon in clear water rivers swim through these sort of gaps in fences. And they've compared these counts to Didson counts, which is, again, very similar to the ARIS, and found that the Didson was basically 100% efficient. So it didn't really miss any fish, and this was in quite sort of high fish with high fish numbers as well that they get on these North American rivers. So there was a really, really good correlation between the Didson count and the ARIS count. Sorry, the Didson count and the counting tower counts. So in this sense, it all looks quite rosy, but then we have to consider counter leakage. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, this is the proportion of fish moving in areas that are not routinely monitored. So on this graph here, I've got a cross-sectional profile of the River Teifi site. So the brown line there indicates the depth of the river. It's the bottom of it's the riverbed basically, and you've got this on the bottom axis. There's distance from the right bank. So that at sort of 21, 22 meters, we've got like almost 3 meters of depth on the site. If we overlay our ARIS beam onto that, bearing in mind it's 14 degrees vertical, we can see that it kind of fits quite nicely into the shape of the riverbed. Now, as I mentioned before, site selection is really critical when we're picking sites for an ARIS deployment. And this site is quite good because it kind of follows the shape of the acoustic beam. But there are areas that aren't really covered by the beam, and these areas are represented by the green areas. You have quite a bit of that on the side. So the far bank up above the rocks, we can't kind of really monitor very well with that beam aim. And by the Aris, you have like a very small field of view close to the Aris, and also underneath the Aris, close in, it's not going to be monitored very well. And there's a near field as well. So for the first 1.5 meters or 2 meters, the Aris beam isn't really formed very well, so you don't really see fish that well. So in these kind of side areas, we have quite a bit of what we call counter leakage. Now, at first sight, that does not look like a particularly large area, but we do know from this site that fish behaviour changes when the flow goes up. So we know the fish movement tends to become concentrated near the side of the river, and also these areas become larger when the flows go up, because obviously you've got more water there, so the river becomes wider. And again, site selection comes into play here. When you're picking one of these sites, you need to make sure you pick somewhere where you have quite steep-sided margins on the river. That kind of keeps the river constrained within an area during spates. So we've kind of, in the past, in the first couple of years of the site, we looked into how much fish movement there was in these areas. And what we did, we deployed a second Didson units, looking down over these sort of leakage areas. And we did this during flood events, basically. So we sort of put the unit at the top of the bank, kind of thing, looking down. And we found that during certain conditions, up to 70% of fish could be missed. So, obviously this can have a big impact on your count. Now, this wasn't during most conditions. Most of the time, we would be counting most of the fish. But during these flood events or spates, and often you get more fish moving during these conditions as well. So it's really important. So some of the solutions we've looked at, we've used to deal with this, we've kind of create these fish defection weirs or fences that push fish out further out in the river when they're migrating into areas where we can sort of pick them up with the Aris. There's a couple of other things we've done as well, which I won't get into now because of time limitations. So the next thing I'd like to consider is species apportionment, which people have already mentioned today. So obviously, if we're counting fish that we don't want to be counting, then we can cause quite a big overcount. So how have we dealt with this on the Teifi? So with Aris, we can only speciate on size, behaviour and body shape. So we can't differentiate a salmon from a sea trout, for instance, using the Aris images. But non-fish events, otters, birds, debris and things like that, we're okay with. We can usually say from the basic shape or other things about the behaviour. Now here's a clip of 3 otters on the Teifi, and you can see the sort of entrained air behind the otters, and that kind of clearly allows us to distinguish them. But I should probably point out at this point that this gets harder the further away from the Aris unit you get. So the wider your river becomes, the more difficult this becomes. So people often ask, can we monitor with an Aris on 40, 50 metre wide rivers? Well, certainly you can count salmon. There's no doubt about that. You'll be able to. I mean, there's an LI Aris unit which can monitor up to sort of 50, 60 metres. But would you be able to differentiate these kind of targets from your salmon targets? And I think beyond 30 metres or so, you're probably going to struggle. Same with eels and lamprey. We can, again, the same issues, but we can generally differentiate them in body shape. Again, it needs a level of training and a bit of experience comes into this. And also you need, if you have new staff doing this, you have to make sure you sort of train them up and you QA any of their work. And this can cause error and a lack of precision in the data if you're not really on the ball with this. So something to consider as well. But salmon and sea trout, then we use length to speciate, but we don't really use a simple sort of size threshold. Partly because there's a lot of overlap, but also because we want to get a sea trout count out as well. What we do, we use a probabilistic based approach, and we assign a probability for each fish of being a salmon or a sea trout using a logistic regression model. We're fortunate on the Teifi in that we have a net fishery just below the counter. It's a coracle fishery, and they record each fish they catch, including the date, the size and the species. So in our model, we have 2 key predictors, and that's the day of the year and the length. The reason the day of the year is important is because the sea trout size generally decreases through the year, so that can affect the probability of any fish being a salmon or a sea trout. And obviously the length is the obvious one. Now for this, accurate sizing is essential. And again, going back to the range effect I talked about earlier, sizing decreases with range, and we've done quite a bit of work looking into this, and we get really good accurate size information up to about 20 meters. But beyond that, the accuracy starts to decrease. Okay, so moving on. Another source of error that I like to consider is from subsampling. Now, we've spoken about the time taken to process this data earlier. An approach we've taken to reduce this is to subsample the data. So we collect the data in 15-minute files, and we basically process every other 15 minutes. Now, a lot of stakeholders and anglers sort of struggle with this concept, but we find that it's quite a useful way of reducing our processing. It's a type of non-replicated systematic sampling, and that introduces its own error. But it's got a number of benefits, including reduction in data processing, but also allows us to change the aim of the unit and allows us to look at different parts of the river. And that can be quite useful because you can use a single unit then to kind of adapt your sort of aim. So there's a trade-off between accuracy and resource, but we've done some work looking at this, and we've used something known as a V5 estimator, and we've looked at the errors involved with these extrapolations, and we generally find that it's less than 10% of the total estimate. So I think we can kind of live with that, with the benefits it gives us. And okay, so finally, I just moved onto a comparison of the rod catch if I've got time still. So here I've got the run estimates for the Teifi. The blue bars are the run estimates from the counter going back to 2010. And we can see, and the maroon coloured bars are the rod catch. And it's the rod catch divided by 5. So I've got them both on the same axis. And we can see that the rod catch is really closely sort of mirrored the salmon run estimates from the counter. We get a bit of a more discrepancy in recent years. Now, the green line is the rod exploitation rate, and we found that the exploitation rates are well within the kind of expected values. So they kind of hovered, in the early years, they hovered around 15 to 16%. Then we had this increase around 2016-17, but we believe that increase was more due to a problem with the online recording system for the angler returns. And then in recent years, we've had this big decline in exploitation down to about 7%. Now, we believe, and all the data seems to suggest this, that this has been down to a reduction in angler effort. So anglers are basically just fishing a lot more due to the decline in runs in recent years. Okay, so finally, I'd just like to summarize. So the semi-automated approach to processing has been optimal for the Teifi, but again, it is site-specific. Despite software improvements, data processing is still quite a big demand on our staff time. And finally, multibeam estimates of salmon stocks can be reliable if they're located in the right location, at the right site, and they're operated correctly, taking account of all the kind of counter leakage issues. Thank you.